The wild stallion was a streak of midnight fury across the Montana grasslands, hooves throwing up clouds of dust that painted the summer sky of 1878 brown, and Jakob Thornton knew he had only one chance to rope that animal before it vanished into the canyon where no man could follow. Jakob had been tracking this particular stallion for 3 weeks, ever since he had spotted the magnificent black beast leading a small herd through the valleys near his cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains. The horse was unlike any he had ever seen, standing at least 16 hands high with a coat so dark it seemed to absorb the sunlight, muscles rippling beneath its hide like water over stones. Jakob was a mountain man through and through, standing well over 6 feet tall with shoulders broad as an axe handle and arms thick with the kind of muscle that came from wrestling timber and surviving winters that could kill a softer man. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, tied back with a strip of leather, and his weathered face bore the scars of a life lived hard and honest in the wilderness. He had built his reputation in these mountains over the past decade, trapping beaver and hunting elk, trading pelts at the posts and avoiding civilization whenever possible. At 32 years old, Jakob preferred the company of the peaks and pines to the noise and complication of towns, but he appreciated fine horses, and this stallion was the finest he had ever laid eyes on. The animal had spirit and strength, and Jakob respected that. He wanted to test himself against such a creature to see if he still had the skill and nerve that had carried him through 1,000 dangerous situations. Now, as the stallion thundered across the open ground, Jakob urged his own mount forward, a sturdy roan gelding named Jasper who had never let him down. The rope was already in his hand, the loop prepared and ready. He had done this before, many times, but never at this speed and never with an animal quite so wild. The stallion seemed to sense pursuit because it stretched out low and fast, eating up the ground with powerful strides that made Jakob's heart pound with admiration even as he closed the distance. The moment came suddenly, that perfect instant when horse and rider and target aligned like stars in a constellation. Jakob rose slightly in his stirrups, swung the rope overhead in 2 quick circles, and released. The loop sailed through the air true as an arrow and dropped over the stallion's head just as the animal began to veer toward the canyon mouth. Jakob immediately wrapped the rope around his saddle horn and braced himself for the impact. When the rope went taut, the stallion screamed and reared, twisting in midair like a tornado given flesh. The force nearly yanked Jakob from the saddle despite his preparation, and Jasper dug in his hooves, skidding through the dirt. But the rope held, and Jakob held, his muscles burning with the strain. The stallion fought with everything it had, bucking and spinning, but Jakob had roped the animal at full gallop, and the battle was already half won. After 5 minutes of furious struggle, the stallion stood trembling, sides heaving, eyes rolling white as it finally accepted the rope's restraint. Jakob dismounted carefully, speaking low and calm. "Easy now, easy. You are something special, are not you? What a fight you have got in you." He approached slowly, keeping the rope firm but not cruel, and reached out to touch the stallion's neck. The animal flinched but did not bolt. Jakob could feel the heart hammering beneath the sweat-slicked hide, could see the intelligence in those dark eyes. This was not a horse that would break easily, nor one that should be broken roughly. This animal deserved respect. As Jakob stood there catching his own breath and admiring his catch, he heard the sound of another horse approaching fast. He turned to see a rider coming up from the direction of the stage road that ran 5 miles south, and even from a distance, he could tell something was wrong by the desperate pace. Jakob quickly secured the stallion to a sturdy juniper tree and remounted Jasper, riding out to intercept the newcomer. The rider resolved into a young woman as the distance closed, and Jakob felt surprise flicker through him. She wore men's clothing, denim trousers, and a work shirt, with a battered hat jammed over dark blonde hair that had come loose from its pins to stream behind her. Her horse was lathered and exhausted, stumbling with fatigue, and her face was streaked with dust and what might have been tears. "Help!" she gasped as soon as she was within earshot. "Please, I need help! My father, there were men, they took everything!" Jakob reached her just as her horse finally gave out, legs buckling beneath it. He was off Jasper in an instant, catching the woman as she tumbled from the saddle. She was light in his arms, but he could feel the trembling of exhaustion and fear running through her. "Slow down," he said, his voice gentle despite its natural roughness. You are safe now. Tell me what happened." She looked up at him with eyes the color of creek water, that shifting green-blue that changed with the light, and Jakob felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with the exertion of roping the stallion. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with a face that was pretty despite the dirt and fear, all fine bones and soft curves that her masculine clothing could not hide. "My name is Clara Hartwell," she said, her voice shaking. "My father and I were traveling to Fort Benton. We had a wagon, all our belongings. 3 men stopped us on the road, maybe 10 miles south of here. They had guns. My father tried to fight them, and they hit him. He was bleeding. They took the wagon, took everything, and told me to run or they would do worse. I got on my father's horse and ran, but I do not know if he is, if they." Her voice broke. Jakob's jaw tightened. He knew the kind of men who preyed on travelers in this territory, cowards who robbed and worse without conscience. "Where exactly did this happen?" She described the location as best she could, a spot where the road ran between 2 hills with thick pine coverage. Jakob knew it. He also knew that if her father was badly hurt and those men had left him, time mattered. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes." "Then you will take my horse. He is tired, but he is strong. Go north until you hit Willow Creek, then follow it west for about 3 miles. You will find my cabin. The door is unlocked. There is food and water and a rifle over the fireplace if you need it. Wait for me there." "But my father—" "I will find him," Jakob said, and his voice carried the weight of a promise. "I will bring him back if he can be moved." Clara searched his face, and whatever she saw there must have reassured her because she nodded. "Thank you. I do not even know your name." "Jakob Thornton." "Thank you, Jakob Thornton." He helped her onto Jasper, giving her quick directions to his cabin. The roan would find the way, even if she got confused. Then Jakob turned to the stallion, still tied to the juniper. The animal watched him warily as he approached. "Well, horse," Jakob said softly, "it looks like we are going to find out right now what you are made of." It was insane, he knew, to try to ride an animal he had roped barely 20 minutes ago. The stallion was wild, untamed, likely to throw him and break his neck. But Clara's father was injured, and possibly dying, and Jakob had just sent his own horse away. He could track to the location on foot, but that would take too long. The stallion was his only option. Jakob untied the rope from the tree but kept it firmly in hand. He spent 5 minutes just talking to the animal, letting it hear his voice, letting it see that he meant no immediate harm. Then, moving with the quick confidence of a man who had gentled many horses, he vaulted onto the stallion's back. The explosion was immediate. The stallion shrieked and bucked, a whirlwind of fury that wanted this human off its back by any means necessary. Jakob clamped his legs tight and grabbed a handful of the thick black mane, becoming part of the animal's motion rather than fighting against it. He had learned this trick from a Nez Perce horse trainer years ago, to move with the horse rather than trying to dominate it through force alone. The stallion spun and kicked and did everything it could to dislodge him, but Jakob held on, his powerful arms and legs locked in place. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, the stallion stopped bucking and instead took off running. If Jakob had thought the animal was fast before, it was nothing compared to this. The stallion ran like the devil himself was chasing them, hooves pounding the earth in a rhythm that sounded like war drums. Jakob leaned low over the animal's neck and used the rope like a rein, gently guiding rather than forcing. To his surprise, the stallion responded, turning when Jakob indicated, slowing fractionally when Jakob pulled back. They covered the 10 miles to the location Clara had described in what must have been record time. Jakob's thighs burned from gripping the horse, and his hands were raw from the rope, but they made it. He spotted the wagon first, overturned on the side of the road with its contents scattered. Then he saw the man lying in the dirt nearby. Jakob slid from the stallion's back, his legs nearly giving out from the strain. He kept hold of the rope and quickly tied the horse to the wagon's exposed wheel, then hurried to the fallen man. Thomas Hartwell, as Jakob would learn his name was, lay on his side with blood matting the gray hair at his temple. But when Jakob pressed his fingers to the man's throat, he found a pulse, steady if a bit weak. "Mr. Hartwell," Jakob said, gently turning the man onto his back, "can you hear me? Your daughter is safe. I am here to help." The man's eyelids fluttered and opened. He was probably in his 50s, with the look of a shopkeeper or clerk, soft around the middle and with hands that bore no calluses. Not the kind of man built for frontier violence. "Clara?" he whispered. "Safe. I sent her to my cabin. Can you move? Are you hurt anywhere besides your head?" Thomas tried to sit up and winced. "Ribs. I think they kicked me after I went down." Jakob carefully examined him, pressing gently along his sides. 2 ribs were likely cracked, maybe 3, but none seemed to have broken cleanly enough to puncture a lung. The head wound looked worse than it was, the kind of cut that bled heavily but was not deep. Thomas would live, but he needed care. "I'm going to get you on my horse," Jakob said. "It is going to hurt." "I do not think I have much choice in the matter." Jakob almost smiled. The man had grit at least. He helped Thomas to his feet, supporting most of his weight, and walked him over to the stallion. The horse danced nervously at their approach, but Jakob spoke to it in that same low, calm voice, and the animal settled slightly. "This is not your horse," Thomas observed weakly. "No. I roped him about an hour ago. Today is a day for firsts, it seems." Getting Thomas onto the stallion's back was a challenge that left both men sweating and breathing hard, but they managed it. Jakob mounted behind him, one arm wrapped around Thomas to keep him steady, the other hand gripping the rope. He was asking a lot of this wild animal to carry 2 men when it had only just been caught, but the stallion seemed to sense the urgency. Or perhaps it was simply too exhausted from the earlier battle and the subsequent run to fight anymore. The journey back to Jakob's cabin took longer than the trip out had. The stallion moved at a steady walk, occasionally tossing its head in frustration, but not bucking or trying to bolt. Jakob kept up a constant stream of quiet words, praising the animal, encouraging it, and gradually he felt some of the tension leave the stallion's body. This was a smart horse, smart enough to understand that cooperation was in its best interest right now. Dusk was painting the mountains purple and gold by the time they reached the cabin. Clara must have been watching for them because the door flew open and she came running out before Jakob even had Thomas dismounted. "Papa!" She reached up to help, and together she and Jakob got Thomas down and into the cabin. Jakob's home was a single large room with a stone fireplace, a bed built into one corner, a table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies, and furs covering the floor and windows. It was sparse but clean and well built, the kind of place that kept a man alive through mountain winters. Jakob directed them to the bed, then turned back to deal with the stallion. The animal stood where Jakob had left it, sides heaving, head low with exhaustion. Jakob untied the rope and on impulse removed it entirely from around the horse's neck. The stallion could run now if it wanted. It was free. But the animal just stood there, watching Jakob with those intelligent dark eyes. "You earned your rest," Jakob said softly. He led the stallion to the small corral behind the cabin where he usually kept Jasper. There was water in the trough and hay in the manger. The stallion followed him without resistance and drank deeply once inside the corral. Jakob left the gate open. If the horse wanted to leave during the night, it could. Back inside, Clara had lit the lamps and was cleaning her father's wounds with water from Jakob's pump. She had found his medical supplies, such as they were, and was working with capable efficiency that suggested she was no stranger to caring for injuries. "You have done this before," Jakob observed. "My mother died when I was 16, Clara said without looking up from her work. After that, it was just Papa and me. He had a mercantile in Springfield, Illinois. I learned to do most things for myself." "What brings you to Montana?" Thomas answered, his voice tired but clearer than before. "The mercantile failed. Bad debts, economic troubles. We lost everything. I heard there were opportunities in Fort Benton, that the town was growing and needed merchants. We sold what little we had left and headed west to start over. I should have known better than to try at my age." "Starting over takes courage at any age," Jakob said. He moved to the fireplace and began building up the fire, then set a pot of water to heat. "I have elk stew from yesterday. Not fancy, but it is filling." Clara finally looked at him fully, and again Jakob felt that strange flutter in his chest. In the lamplight, cleaned up a bit from the trail dust, she was more than pretty. She was beautiful in a way that seemed to belong to these mountains, all natural grace and strength beneath the feminine softness. "You have been very kind," she said. "We owe you our lives." You do not owe me anything. This is wild country. People help each other, or we all die." They ate Jakob's stew in relative silence, exhaustion claiming all three of them. Thomas's eyes kept drifting closed between bites, and Clara looked ready to fall asleep in her chair. Jakob gave them the bed, insisting over their protests, and made himself a pallet of furs near the fireplace. It was not the first time he had slept on his own floor, and it would not be the last. But despite his own exhaustion, Jakob lay awake for a long time, listening to the soft breathing of his unexpected guests, and thinking about creek water eyes and the feel of a wild stallion beneath him. Outside, the night sounds of the mountains played their familiar symphony, and somewhere in that darkness, three men who preyed on innocent travelers were going about their business. Jakob's jaw tightened. That was a problem that would need addressing, but not tonight. Tonight, everyone under his roof was safe, and that was enough. When Jakob woke before dawn, as was his habit, he found Clara already up and quietly stoking the fire. She turned at his movement and put a finger to her lips, nodding toward her father, who still slept. "He had a rough night," she whispered. The pain in his ribs kept waking him. Jakob nodded and gestured for her to follow him outside. The morning air was cold and clean, the sky just beginning to lighten in the east. They walked away from the cabin before speaking in normal tones. "He needs a doctor," Jakob said. "Is there one nearby?" "In Stevensville, about a day's ride south. But I think your father is not fit to travel that far yet. Best to let him rest a few days, let those ribs start to heal a bit." Clara wrapped her arms around herself against the chill. "We have already imposed on you too much." "You have not imposed at all. I offered my home. The offer stands for as long as you need it." She looked at him then, really looked at him, studying his face in the growing light. "Why are you being so kind to strangers?" Jakob considered the question. "I told you last night, this is wild country. But there is more to it than that, I suppose. I've been alone in these mountains for a long time. Maybe I forgot what it was like to have someone need my help. Feels good to remember." "How long have you been out here?" 10 years, give or take. Came west after the war." Clara's expression softened with understanding. Many men had come west after the war between the states, carrying wounds both visible and invisible, looking for a place to heal or to forget or simply to survive. She did not press for details. "I should check on the Stallion," Jakob said, more to change the subject than anything else. They walked together to the corral. Jakob half expected to find it empty, the horse having fled during the night, but the Stallion was still there. It stood in the center of the enclosure, watching their approach with wary but not panicked eyes. Jakob was astonished. The horse had been wild just yesterday, and now it remained by choice in a space it could easily leave. "That is the horse that brought us back?" Clara asked, clearly impressed. "You rode that animal?" "More like he tolerated me riding him. I roped him right before I met you. He was running wild with a herd in the valley." "He is magnificent." "Yes, he is." They stood side by side at the corral fence, watching the Stallion. After a few minutes, the horse took a tentative step toward them, then another. Jakob remained perfectly still, not even breathing loudly, and Clara seemed to sense the importance of the moment because she froze as well. The Stallion approached slowly, stretching out its neck, nostrils flaring as it scented them both. Then, the horse took the final steps and pushed its nose against Jakob's chest, blowing out a soft breath. Jakob raised his hand carefully and touched the Stallion's forehead, stroking gently between its eyes. "I will be damned," he breathed. "I think he has decided to trust me." "What will you name him?" Clara asked. Jakob had not thought about a name. He looked at the horse, at its midnight coat and fierce beauty, and thought about how it had run like darkness itself across the grasslands. "Shadow," he said. "I will call him Shadow." Over the next 3 days, a routine established itself in Jakob's cabin. Thomas rested and slowly healed, his head wound scabbing over and his ribs hurting less with each passing day. Clara proved herself remarkably capable, cooking meals from Jakob's supplies that were far better than anything he had made himself, mending a rip in his spare shirt without being asked, and generally bringing a sense of order and warmth to the cabin that it had lacked before. Jakob spent his days tending to the necessary work of survival in the mountains, checking his trap lines, hunting, chopping wood, and working with Shadow. The Stallion's transformation was nothing short of remarkable. Jakob had gentled horses before, but never one that seemed so eager to learn, so willing to meet him halfway. By the second day, Shadow accepted a halter. By the third, Jakob could brush him without the horse flinching away. They were building trust slowly and steadily, and Jakob found the process deeply satisfying. Clara often watched him work with Shadow, sitting on the corral fence with her face turned to the sun. She asked questions about horse training, about mountain living, about everything she saw that was new to her. Jakob found he enjoyed teaching her, enjoyed the way her face lit up with understanding or delight. They talked easily together, the conversation flowing naturally whether they discussed serious matters or trivial ones. On the evening of the third day, after they had eaten dinner and Thomas had retired to the bed for the night, Jakob and Clara sat outside on the rough bench Jakob had built in front of his cabin. The stars were out in force, that vast sprawl of light possible only in places far from cities and towns. "I have never seen so many stars," Clara said softly. "In Springfield you could see some, but nothing like this." "The mountain sky is special," Jakob agreed. "I never get tired of looking at it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the forest. Then Clara spoke again, her voice quiet but clear. "Jakob, what are we going to do?" "What do you mean?" "Papa and I have nothing. Those men took everything we owned. We have no wagon, no supplies, no money. We cannot make it to Fort Benton with nothing, and even if we could, we would arrive with no means to start the business Papa planned. We are completely dependent on your charity, and that cannot continue forever." Jakob had been thinking about this very problem, though he had not voiced it. "Your father is educated, yes? He ran a mercantile, so he knows business and numbers?" "Yes. Why?" "Stevensville needs a school teacher, the one they had left last year to get married, and they have not been able to replace her. The pay is not much, but it comes with a small house and enough to live on. If your father is interested, I could speak to the town council on his behalf." Clara turned to look at him, surprise clear on her face even in the starlight. "You would do that? You would help us even more than you already have?" "I would." "But why? We are nothing to you, just strangers who stumbled into your life." Jakob considered how to answer. The truth was complicated, a tangle of loneliness and attraction, and something he was not quite ready to name. "You are not nothing to me," he said finally, carefully. "You have brought something to this cabin that has been missing. Life, I suppose. Warmth. I forgot what that was like, having people around who mattered." "We matter to you?" Clara's voice was very soft. "You do." The silence that followed was different from before, charged with an awareness that had been building between them for days but had not yet been acknowledged. Jakob could feel Clara's presence beside him like heat from a fire, could hear her breathing and smell the faint scent of the soap she had used to wash her hair. He wanted to reach for her hand, to touch her, but he held himself still. It was too soon, too fast, and she was vulnerable, dependent on him. He would not take advantage of that. "Jakob," Clara said, and now her voice trembled slightly. "I think I should tell you something. I feel, that is, being here with you has made me feel." She stopped, frustrated. "I'm saying this badly." "You do not have to say anything," Jakob told her gently, though his heart was pounding. "But I want to. I need to. Since we arrived here, you have been nothing but kind and honorable. You have treated me with respect and care, and I find that I think about you. When you are out working with Shadow or checking your traps, I find myself watching the tree line for your return. When we talk, I do not want the conversation to end. I have never felt this way before, and I do not quite know what to do with these feelings." Jakob's chest felt tight. He turned to face her fully, seeing the uncertainty and hope mingled in her expression. "Clara, I need you to understand something. You've been through a terrible experience. You and your father were robbed and hurt, and you are far from everything familiar. Sometimes in situations like that, people can mistake gratitude or relief for something else. You think I do not know my own mind. I think you are young and you have been through a shock. I think 3 days is not very long to know someone. And I think that you are dependent on me right now for survival, which makes everything complicated." He took a breath. "But I also think that you are brave and beautiful and interesting, and that these last 3 days have been some of the best I have had in years. So I am not dismissing what you are saying. I am just asking that we go slow, that we give this, whatever this is, time to develop properly. If what you are feeling is real, it will still be real in a month or 2 months or 6 months. And if it is not, then we will have avoided making a mistake that could hurt you. Clara studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. That is very wise and very honorable. My father would like you even more if he heard you say that. Your father likes me? He told me today that you are a good man and that I could do far worse. I think he was giving me permission in his way. Jakob felt something warm bloom in his chest. Slow and steady, Clara. I roped Shadow at full gallop, but I am courting you slow and steady and true. You deserve that. Courting? She smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her since they met. So you admit you are courting me? I am saying I would like to. If you are willing, if your father approves, and if you still feel the same way once you have had time to think clearly. I think I can agree to those terms, Jakob Thornton. They sat together a while longer, not touching but close enough to feel each other's warmth, and looked at the stars. Jakob felt a sense of rightness settle over him, a feeling that maybe the loneliness of the past decade was finally coming to an end. But he meant what he had said. He would court Clara properly, slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind. She deserved nothing less. The next morning, Jakob rode Jasper, who had been resting and recuperating, into Stevensville to speak with the town council about the teaching position. He left Clara and Thomas at the cabin, confident they would be safe. Before he left, he showed Clara where he kept his spare rifle and how to load and fire it, just in case. Stevensville was a small settlement, barely more than a handful of buildings clustered around a trading post and a mission, but it served the scattered ranches and homesteads in the valley. Jakob knew most of the people there by sight, if not by name, and he conducted his business quickly. The council was indeed desperate for a teacher, and once Jakob vouched for Thomas Hartwell's character and education, they were willing to meet with him. It was arranged that Jakob would bring Thomas to town in a few days, once the man was fit to travel. While in town, Jakob also visited the marshal, such as he was. John Cooper was more of a part-time lawman, a rancher who took on the job because someone had to do it. Jakob described the robbery and the 3 men as best he could from Clara's description. Cooper listened, took notes, and promised to keep an eye out, but they both knew the chances of catching the robbers were slim. Men like that tended to drift, hitting different spots along the stage roads and then moving on before they could be caught. Jakob also stopped at the general store and used some of his carefully hoarded money to buy cloth, needles, thread, and a few other supplies he thought Clara might appreciate. He told himself it was just practical, that she needed proper clothes since hers had been in the stolen wagon, but he knew it was more than that. He wanted to give her things, to see her face light up with pleasure. The ride back to the cabin took most of the day, and Jakob arrived as the sun was setting. He found Clara outside, hanging laundry she had washed in the creek, and the domestic sight of it did something to his heart. She turned at the sound of Jasper's hooves and smiled, wiping her damp hands on the apron she wore, one of Jakob's own that she had appropriated and belted to fit her smaller frame. "How did it go?" she asked as he dismounted. "Good. The council wants to meet your father. I told them we would come to town in a few days. That is wonderful news. Papa will be so relieved." Jakob pulled the wrapped bundle of cloth and supplies from his saddlebag. "I brought you something." Clara took the bundle with curious eyes and unwrapped it carefully. When she saw what was inside, her expression transformed into pure delight. "Jakob, this is too much. You should not have spent your money. You need clothes. This is practical." "This is not just practical. Look at this fabric. It is beautiful. And ribbon too? That is not practical at all." But she was smiling as she said it, holding the ribbon up to catch the last rays of sunlight. "Maybe I wanted to buy you something that was not practical. Is that allowed?" Clara's smile softened into something that made Jakob's breath catch. "It is allowed. Thank you, Jakob. Truly." They stood there for a moment, looking at each other, and Jakob felt the pull between them like a physical force. It would be so easy to close the distance, to pull her into his arms and kiss her the way he increasingly wanted to. But he had promised slow and steady, and he would keep that promise even if it killed him. "I should see to Jasper," he said, stepping back, "and you should show your father what you have got. He will want to hear about the teaching position." Over the following week, patterns deepened into something more solid. Thomas recovered enough to travel, and Jakob took him to Stevensville to meet with the town council. The meeting went well. Thomas impressed them with his knowledge and his clear desire for the work, and they offered him the position on the spot. The schoolhouse and attached living quarters needed some work, having stood empty for over a year, but Thomas and Clara were both eager to accept. This should have been cause for pure celebration, but Jakob felt a hollow ache in his chest at the thought of them leaving his cabin. He had grown accustomed to Clara's presence, to waking and finding her already up and making breakfast, to coming in from his work and seeing her mending by the fireplace or reading one of his few books. The cabin would feel empty without her, without them. But he helped them prepare to move, riding into town with them when the day came. He helped Thomas clean the schoolhouse and repair the broken shutters and patch the roof where it leaked. He helped Clara scrub the living quarters and move in the simple furniture the town provided. He did all of this with a smile and words of encouragement, even as he felt Clara slipping away from him. On their last evening before Jakob was set to return to his cabin in the mountains, Clara asked him to take a walk with her. They left Thomas settling in and walked through the town and out toward the fields beyond, where the grass grew tall and the mountains rose purple in the distance. "I do not want you to go," Clara said finally, the words bursting out as though she'd been holding them back with great effort. "I have to. I have traps to check, a life up there." I know you do. But these past 2 weeks, Jakob, they have been the happiest I have had since my mother died. And I hope, that maybe you felt something of the same." "I did," Jakob admitted. "I do." "Then what are we doing? Why are we separating?" Jakob stopped walking and turned to face her. "Because this is your chance to build a life here in town. Your father has good work, honorable work. You will have neighbors and society and safety. What do I have to offer compared to that? A cabin in the mountains, isolation, danger. You deserve better, Clara." "Should not I be the one to decide what I deserve?" Her eyes flashed with frustration and something deeper. "You said you would court me slow and steady. How can you do that if you are up in the mountains and I am down here in town?" "I will visit. I come to town for supplies anyway, once a month or so." "Once a month?" "Jakob, that is not courting. That is, I do not know what that is, but it is not enough." She was right, and Jakob knew it. But what was the alternative? He could not ask her to give up the security of the town to live in the wilderness with him, not after everything she had been through. And he could not imagine leaving the mountains permanently, trading his freedom and solitude for the constraints of town life. It was an impossible situation. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, and he could hear the helplessness in his own voice. "I want you to admit that what is between us is real and worth fighting for. I want you to believe that I know my own heart. I want you to trust that I am strong enough to choose my own path, even if that path is difficult." She stepped closer, looking up at him with those creek-water eyes that had haunted his dreams. "I want you to kiss me, Jakob Thornton, because I think I will go mad if you do not." Jacob's control, so carefully maintained for 2 weeks, shattered. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and it was like nothing he had ever experienced. Clara melted against him, her hands fisting in his shirt, and kissed him back with a passion that matched his own. He could taste the salt of tears on her lips, though he was not sure if they were hers or his. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jakob rested his forehead against hers. "I am falling in love with you," he said roughly. "I think I have been since the moment you rode into my life on that exhausted horse. But I am terrified of asking you to sacrifice for me." "Then do not ask. Let me choose. I choose you, Jakob. I choose us. Your father will understand. He wants me to be happy, and you make me happy." They stood there in the tall grass as the sun set, and the stars began to appear, holding each other and making promises without words. Jakob knew there were still obstacles to overcome, details to work out, but for the moment none of that mattered. What mattered was the woman in his arms and the certainty settling into his bones that he had found something worth more than all the solitude in the world. When they returned to the schoolhouse, Thomas took one look at their faces and smiled knowingly. "I suppose I should have a talk with you, young man," he said to Jakob, but his tone was warm. "Yes, sir. I would appreciate that." They sat at the small table in the living quarters while Clara busied herself making coffee, though Jakob suspected she was listening to every word. Thomas regarded him seriously. "My daughter is the most precious thing in my life," he began. "After my wife died, Clara became my whole world. I would do anything to protect her and ensure her happiness." "I understand, sir. I do not think you do, not entirely. You see, Clara's mother was not some delicate flower. She was strong and stubborn and brave. She chose to marry me even though her family disapproved, even though I had little money and uncertain prospects. She chose love over comfort, and she never regretted that choice, not even on the hardest days. Clara is her mother's daughter in every way that matters." Thomas leaned forward, his expression intense. "So when my daughter tells me she wants to build a life with a mountain man, a man who lives far from civilization and all its comforts, my first instinct is to forbid it. But then I remember my wife, and I remember that the strongest people I have ever known were women who chose their own paths. So I am not going to forbid anything. Instead, I am going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer me honestly." "Anything," Jakob said. "Will you love my daughter with everything you have? Will you protect her and cherish her and treat her as the gift she is? Will you be faithful and true to her, no matter what difficulties come? Because life in the wilderness is hard, and there will be times when you are tested. I need to know that you will not break when that happens." Jakob met Thomas's eyes steadily. "Sir, I roped a wild stallion at full gallop. I broke horses for the cavalry during the war. I have survived mountain winters that killed other men and hunted grizzly bears and lived through things I do not like to talk about. I do not say this to brag, only to tell you that I know what it means to commit to something difficult and see it through. I promise you that I will love Clara with everything I have. I will protect her with my life if necessary. I will be faithful to her until the day I die, and I will spend every day trying to be worthy of the gift of her love." Thomas studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then you have my blessing. But know this, I may be a school teacher and not a mountain man, but if you ever hurt my daughter, I will find a way to make you regret it." "I would expect nothing less, sir." Clara, who had given up all pretense of not listening, came to the table and threw her arms around her father. "Thank you, Papa. Thank you for understanding. Just be happy, my girl. That's all I have ever wanted for you." The conversation then turned to practical matters. Jakob could not simply take Clara back to his cabin immediately. She needed time to make a proper wedding dress from the cloth he had bought her, and Thomas wanted to see them married properly before his daughter went off to live in the mountains. They decided on a month, which would give them time to arrange a small wedding and for Clara to prepare. Jakob returned to his cabin the next day, but this time the separation felt different. He was not losing Clara, but rather waiting for her, and the anticipation was almost sweet despite the loneliness. He spent the month preparing. He expanded the cabin, adding a separate sleeping area with a real door for privacy. He built a proper wardrobe for Clara's clothes and shelves for whatever belongings she would bring. He hunted and trapped and smoked meat, building up their supplies for the coming winter. And he worked with Shadow, continuing the stallion's training until the horse responded to voice commands and the lightest touch of the reins. Every week, Jakob rode down to Stevensville to see Clara. They took walks together, properly chaperoned by Thomas, and talked about everything under the sun. They discussed how their life would work, the rhythm of seasons in the mountains, the realities of isolation and hard work. Jakob held nothing back, wanting Clara to understand fully what she was choosing. But she never wavered, never showed any doubt. She asked questions, learned everything she could, and began preparing herself mentally and practically for her new life. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning, with the aspens turned gold on the mountainsides and the air carrying the first hint of the winter to come. The ceremony was held in the small church in Stevensville, with Thomas giving Clara away and most of the town in attendance. Clara wore a dress she had sewn herself from the cloth Jakob had given her, and she looked so beautiful that Jakob felt his throat tighten with emotion when he saw her walking toward him down the aisle. They spoke their vows in front of the traveling preacher who visited Stevensville once a month, and when Jakob was told he could kiss his bride, he did so with great tenderness, mindful of their audience but unable to hide the depth of his feeling. Clara's eyes were bright with unshed tears, and her smile was radiant. The town put on a small celebration afterward, with food and music and dancing. Jakob, who had spent most of the last decade avoiding such social gatherings, found himself enjoying it, because Clara was so happy. She danced with her father and with several of the townsmen who had come to regard her fondly during her month in Stevensville. And she danced with Jakob, who was clumsy at it, but did his best, and she laughed with such joy that he thought his heart might burst. As the sun began to set, Jakob and Clara said their goodbyes. Thomas hugged his daughter tightly, whispering something in her ear that made her nod seriously. Then he turned to Jakob and shook his hand. "Take care of her," he said. "With my life," Jakob promised. They rode out of town on Jasper, with Shadow trailing behind them on a lead rope. Clara sat in front of Jakob in the saddle, his arms around her, and they made the journey to the cabin as the stars came out overhead. When they arrived, Jakob dismounted first and then lifted Clara down. But instead of setting her on her feet, he carried her across the threshold as tradition demanded. Inside, the cabin glowed with the light from the fire Jakob had banked before leaving that morning. He had cleaned everything, laid out the furs on their new bed, and left wildflowers in a jar on the table. Clara looked around with shining eyes. "It is perfect," she said softly. "Jakob, it is perfect." He set her down gently and cupped her face in his hands. "Are you sure about this? About me? It is not too late to change your mind. I could take you back to your father, and no one would blame you." "I am not changing my mind. I am exactly where I want to be, with exactly who I want to be with." She rose on her toes and kissed him. "I love you, Jakob Thornton. Now stop giving me chances to escape and take your wife to bed." Jakob needed no further encouragement. He swept her up in his arms again and carried her to the new bed he had built, and there in the firelight and privacy of their home, they came together as husband and wife for the first time. Jakob was gentle and patient, mindful of Clara's innocence, and she was brave and loving and everything he had ever dreamed of. When they finally lay tangled together in the aftermath, both breathless and glowing, Clara rested her head on his chest and sighed contentedly. "I did not know it could be like that," she whispered. "Neither did I," Jakob admitted. He had been with women before, but never with love, never with this depth of feeling and connection. "I did not know anything could be like that." They lay together talking softly until sleep claimed them, warm and safe and happier than either had ever been. The first months of their marriage were an adjustment for both of them, but they navigated the challenges with patience and growing confidence. Clara learned the rhythms of mountain life, how to read the weather and preserve food and handle a rifle when Jakob was away checking his traps. She proved to be a quick study and more capable than she had given herself credit for. Jakob, for his part, learned how to share his space and his life after a decade of solitude. It was not always easy, but it was always worthwhile. Winter came early and hard that year, with snows that piled higher than the cabin windows and temperatures that dropped low enough to freeze breath in the air. But inside their home, Jakob and Clara were cozy and content. They spent the long, dark evenings reading aloud to each other, playing cards, making love, and talking about everything and nothing. Jakob taught Clara to tan hides, and Clara taught Jakob to dance properly, and they laughed at each other's mistakes and celebrated each other's successes. Shadow became Clara's horse as much as Jakob's, responding to her voice and touch with the same trust he showed Jakob. She spent hours grooming the stallion and talking to him, and the horse seemed to understand that this woman was now part of his herd, to be protected and cared for. In February, when the snows began to lessen and the days started imperceptibly lengthening, Clara told Jakob she was pregnant. He was stunned at first, though he should not have been surprised, and then overwhelmed with joy and terror in equal measure. A baby, here in the wilderness, far from doctors and help. But Clara was calm and confident. "Women have been having babies in difficult circumstances since the beginning of time," she told him. "We will be fine. You will see." Jakob rode into Stevensville as soon as the trails were passable to speak with the midwife, a capable older woman named Mrs. Brennan, who had delivered half the babies in the valley. She agreed to come stay with them when Clara's time grew near, and she gave Jakob a list of supplies to gather and instructions on what to expect. Thomas, when he heard the news, was delighted at the prospect of becoming a grandfather, though he shared Jakob's concern about the isolation. Spring arrived, and with it came the hard work of preparing for the baby. Jakob built a cradle from smooth pine, carving it with careful attention to detail. Clara sewed tiny clothes and blankets, using cloth she had saved and some that Mrs. Brennan contributed. They argued gently over names, both wanting to honor Clara's mother if the baby was a girl, and eventually agreeing on Margaret Rose if it was a girl and Thomas if it was a boy. As summer ripened and Clara's belly swelled, Jakob found himself torn between overwhelming love for his wife and the baby growing inside her, and fear that something would go wrong. He had seen death too many times in his life, during the war and after, and the thought of losing Clara or the baby was almost more than he could bear. Clara, sensing his fear, took his hands one evening and placed them on her belly. The baby kicked strong and sure, and Clara smiled. "Feel that? This baby is a fighter, just like its parents. We are going to be fine, Jakob. You have to believe that." And he tried to believe it, tried to have her faith. Mrs. Brennan came to stay with them in late August, establishing herself in the main room of the cabin and taking charge with the kind of brisk efficiency that was both comforting and intimidating. Clara's labor began on a hot afternoon when the sky was so blue it hurt to look at. Jakob paced outside the cabin, barred from entry by Mrs. Brennan, who told him firmly that he would only be in the way. He heard Clara crying out in pain and thought he might go mad from the helplessness of it. But then, as the sun was setting and painting the mountains red and gold, he heard a different sound. The thin, furious wail of a newborn baby. Mrs. Brennan appeared in the doorway, smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Thornton. A big, healthy boy. And your wife did beautifully. Come meet your child." Jakob's legs felt weak as he entered the cabin. Clara lay in their bed, exhausted and pale, but smiling, as she cradled a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up as he approached, and her smile widened. "Come see him, Jakob. Come see our son." Jakob knelt beside the bed and looked at the baby for the first time. The infant was red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists waving in the air. He was the most perfect thing Jakob had ever seen. "Thomas," Clara said softly. "His name is Thomas, like we agreed. Thomas Jakob Thornton." "Thomas," Jakob repeated, his voice rough with emotion. He reached out and touched one tiny fist, and the baby's fingers closed around his much larger one with surprising strength. "Hello, son. I am your papa." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "We made him, Jakob. We made this perfect little person." "You made him. You did all the hard work. I just stood outside and worried." "We made him together," Clara insisted, "and we will raise him together, our family." Jakob looked at his wife and his newborn son and felt a sense of completeness he had never known before. This was what life was supposed to be. This was what mattered. Not the isolation or the adventure or the freedom of the mountains, but this, love, family, connection. He had roped a wild stallion at full gallop, but he had courted Clara slow and steady and true, and it had led him here, to this moment, to everything he had ever wanted without knowing he wanted it. The months that followed were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Baby Thomas was healthy and strong-lunged, keeping his parents awake at all hours with his demands for food and comfort. But every sleepless night was worth it for the moments of pure joy, watching Thomas grow and change, seeing his personality emerge. He was a good-natured baby for the most part, curious about everything, always watching and learning. Jakob proved to be a natural father, patient and gentle with his son, despite his size and rough exterior. He carried Thomas in a sling Clara made, keeping the baby close while he did his work around the cabin. He sang to him in a surprisingly pleasant voice old songs from before the war that he had thought he had forgotten. And he told Thomas stories, tales of the mountains and the animals, of brave deeds and noble hearts. Clara bloomed in motherhood, capable and confident. She managed the household and the baby with the same efficiency she had brought to everything else, but she also knew when to let Jakob help, when to share the burdens and joys. They were partners in every sense of the word, and their love deepened with each passing day. That first winter with a baby was challenging. Thomas was teething and fussy, and the close quarters of the cabin during the worst storms tried everyone's patience. But they made it through, supporting each other, taking turns walking Thomas when he cried, finding small moments of joy even in the hardest days. When spring came again and the trails cleared, they made the journey to Stevensville so Thomas could meet his grandfather. The older man wept openly when Clara placed the baby in his arms, and he held his grandson with a tenderness that reminded Jakob why he had approved of this union in the first place. Thomas Hartwell understood love, understood sacrifice, understood what truly mattered. They visited Stevensville more frequently after that, wanting young Thomas to know his grandfather and to have some connection to community beyond just his parents. Jakob found he did not mind the trips as much as he once would have. He was still a mountain man at heart, still preferred the wilderness to town, but he understood now that isolation was not the same as independence. A man could be strong and free while still maintaining ties to others. In fact, true strength lay in building those connections, in being part of something larger than oneself. As Thomas grew from baby to toddler, Shadow became his constant companion whenever they were outside. The Stallion, now fully gentle and trained, watched over the boy with a protectiveness that rivaled Jakob's own. Thomas learned to walk by holding on to Shadow's mane, and he took his first pony ride on the Stallion's back with Jakob's hand steadying him. It was clear that the bond between horse and family was unbreakable. When Thomas was 2 years old, Clara told Jakob she was pregnant again. This time there was less fear and more joy, though Jakob still worried as the months passed. But Clara had an easier time with this pregnancy, and when her labor began on a cool October evening, it progressed quickly. Mrs. Brennan, once again in attendance, delivered a baby girl just after midnight. "Margaret Rose," Clara said, looking at her daughter with wonder, "just like we planned." Margaret had her mother's creekwater eyes and her father's dark hair, and she was tiny and perfect. Thomas, meeting his sister for the first time the next morning, reached out a chubby hand to touch her face with surprising gentleness. "Baby," he said clearly. "My baby." "Your sister," Jakob corrected, lifting his son up so he could see better. "You are a big brother now, Thomas. That means you help take care of her." "Help," Thomas agreed seriously. The cabin that had once housed only Jakob now rang with the sounds of family. Children's laughter, Clara's singing, the constant activity of daily life. Jakob had added on to the structure, building another room so the children would have their own space as they grew. The corral now housed not just Shadow, but also Jasper, and a gentle mare Jakob had traded for, so that Clara could ride when she wanted. The years passed in the way years do, marked by seasons and growth and small milestones that added up to a life fully lived. Thomas grew tall and strong, taking after his father in build and temperament, though he had his mother's gentle heart. Margaret was fierce and stubborn and clever, a force of nature from the time she could walk. 2 more children followed, another boy they named Jakob Jr., and a girl they named Elizabeth, after Jakob's mother. The cabin became a home, full of love and noise, and the controlled chaos of raising 4 children in the wilderness. Jakob's traplines expanded into a small trading business, and he became known throughout the valley as an honest dealer and a man of his word. Clara taught all the children to read and write, using books borrowed from Thomas Sr. and supplemented by whatever she could get from the occasional peddler who passed through. The children grew up strong and capable, learning to hunt and track from their father, to cook and sew and manage a household from their mother. They learned to ride almost before they could walk, and Shadow, now aging but still proud, tolerated the children with patient grace. Thomas Sr. eventually retired from teaching, his age and the demands of the position becoming too much. He came to live with Jakob and Clara in the mountains, moving into the new addition Jakob built specially for him. The old man delighted in his grandchildren and found peace in the wilderness that had claimed his daughter's heart years before. He lived to see young Thomas turn 18 and Margaret turn 16, and he passed quietly in his sleep one winter night with his family around him. They buried him on a hillside overlooking the valley with a view of the mountains he had come to love. Clara mourned her father deeply, but she was comforted by the knowledge that he had spent his last years happy and surrounded by love. Jakob carved a headstone from a single piece of granite, marking it with Thomas Hartwell's name and the dates of his birth and death, and below that, the simple words, beloved father and grandfather. As Jacob himself aged, his hair turning silver and his face gaining new lines, he never lost the strength that had defined him. He still stood tall and broad-shouldered, still moved with the confidence of a man who knew the wilderness intimately. And Clara, though she gained some softness around the edges and some silver in her own hair, remained as beautiful to Jakob as the day he had first seen her riding desperately toward him on that exhausted horse. They often sat together in the evenings, watching their grandchildren play in the yard in front of the cabin, and reflected on the life they had built. Thomas, their eldest, had married a rancher's daughter and settled on a homestead 10 miles west. Margaret had shocked everyone by declaring her intention to become a doctor, and she had gone east to study medicine, promising to return and serve the people of Montana. Jakob Jr. worked with his father, learning the business in the mountains, and Elizabeth, the youngest, was still deciding her path but showed a talent for horses that rivaled her father's. "Did you ever imagine this?" Clara asked one evening, her hand in Jakob's as they watched the sun set over the peaks. "When you were alone in this cabin all those years ago, did you ever imagine you would have all this?" "Never," Jakob admitted. "I thought I would live and die alone up here, and I had made my peace with that. Then you rode into my life and changed everything. You roped a wild stallion at full gallop that day, and I courted you slow and steady and true." Jakob smiled. "Best decision I ever made, taking my time with you, giving you the chance to know your own mind, to choose this life with full knowledge of what it meant. I never doubted my choice, not once, not even on the hardest days." "Nor I." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, then Clara spoke again. "Jakob, I want to thank you." "For what?" "For everything. For saving my father and me that day, for being patient and honorable, for loving me so completely, for giving me these children, this life. For every day of the past 27 years, you have made me happier than I ever thought possible." Jakob turned to look at his wife, seeing in her face the young woman who had asked him to kiss her all those years ago, and the strong mother who had borne his children, and the wise grandmother who now helped guide the next generation. She was all of these things and more, and his love for her had only grown with time. "Clara Thornton, you are the greatest gift I ever received. I roped Shadow at full gallop, yes, but that was just a test of skill. Courting you, marrying you, building this life with you, that was the real challenge and the real victory. And I would do it all again in a heartbeat." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they watched as Shadow, now an old horse himself with a gray muzzle and stiff joints, walked slowly to the fence where Elizabeth waited with an apple. The stallion that Jakob had captured so many years ago took the treat gently from the girl's hand, and she stroked his face with obvious affection. "He is slowing down," Clara observed quietly. "Shadow, I mean." "Yes, he's had a good life, though, better than running wild until age or injury or predators caught up with him." "Do you ever regret it? Capturing him, taming him?" Jakob considered the question seriously. "No, I gave him safety and purpose. He gave me trust and loyalty. And he was there when I needed him most, that day I met you. Everything is connected, Clara. Everything led to this." As if hearing his name, Shadow turned his great head to look at Jakob and Clara on the porch. The horse's eyes were still bright despite his age, still intelligent and aware. Jakob raised a hand in acknowledgement, and the stallion tossed his head once before turning his attention back to Elizabeth. The seasons continued their endless cycle, and life in the mountains went on. Shadow passed peacefully in his sleep during the winter of 1905, and they buried him near the cabin, marking his grave with a cairn of stones. The children mourned him as they would a family member, which he had been. Jakob himself continued strong into his 60s, still trapping and hunting, though not with the same intensity as his younger years. He taught his sons and grandsons everything he knew about surviving and thriving in the wilderness, and he never stopped courting Clara, bringing her wildflowers in summer and carving her small gifts in winter, telling her he loved her every single day. When Margaret returned from medical school with her degree and set up a practice in Stevensville, the whole family celebrated. She was the first female doctor in the valley, and she faced prejudice and doubt, but she persevered with the same stubborn determination her mother had shown. Jakob was immensely proud of all his children, but Margaret's achievement particularly moved him, because it showed that the values he and Clara had instilled, the belief that people could choose their own paths and achieve their dreams through hard work, had taken root. As Jakob entered his 70s, he finally began to slow down noticeably. His joints ached on cold mornings, and he tired more easily than before. But his mind remained sharp, and his love for Clara never dimmed. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, and it was a day of joy and reflection. That night, lying in bed beside Clara, Jakob spoke into the darkness. "I want you to know something." "What is that?" Clara's voice was soft, familiar, beloved. "If I had my life to live over, I would not change a single thing. Every moment, every choice led me to you and to this family. I am the luckiest man who ever lived." Clara rolled over to face him, her hand finding his in the darkness. "We are both lucky. We found each other, and we built something beautiful. Not everyone gets that." "No, not everyone does." They fell asleep holding hands, as they had done countless nights before, and Jakob dreamed of riding across open grasslands with a rope in his hand and hope in his heart. Jakob Thornton lived to the age of 76, passing away on a bright spring morning in 1922 with Clara beside him and his children gathered around. His last words were to his wife, a simple, "I love you," that carried the weight of more than 50 years of devotion. Clara held his hand as he slipped away, and though she mourned deeply, she was grateful for every day they had shared. Clara herself lived another 8 years, staying in the mountain cabin that had been her home for most of her life. Her children tried to convince her to move to town, to live with one of them where she would be more comfortable, but she refused. This was where she had lived with Jakob, where they had raised their family, where every tree and stone held a memory. She would not leave it. She spent her final years tending the graves of her husband and her father, walking the familiar trails and visiting with the endless stream of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who came to see her. She told them stories of Jakob, of the day they met, of how he had roped a wild stallion at full gallop, but courted her slow and steady and true. She told them about the values that had guided their life together: patience, respect, honor, love. Clara passed away peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1930 at the age of 73. They buried her beside Jakob on the hillside under the vast Montana sky they had both loved. Her headstone, carved by her grandson Thomas Jr., bore her name and dates, and below that, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She chose love. The cabin in the mountains remained in the Thornton family, passed down through the generations. It was expanded and modernized over the years, but the original structure that Jakob built remained at its heart. The family used it as a gathering place, a reminder of where they came from, and the love story that had started it all. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind whispered through the pines and the stars blazed overhead, those who stayed in the cabin swore they could feel the presence of Jakob and Clara, still together, still in love, still watching over the family they had created. The story of the mountain man who roped a wild stallion at full gallop but courted his wife slow and steady and true became family legend, passed down to each new generation as a reminder of what real love looked like. It was a love built on respect and patience, on trust earned slowly and kept faithfully. It was a love tested by hardship and isolation, but strengthened by each challenge overcome. It was a love that created a family and a legacy that endured long after both lovers had passed into memory. And it all began with a desperate young woman riding an exhausted horse, a mountain man with rope in hand, and a wild stallion running free across the Montana grasslands in the summer of 1878. The Thornton descendants still gather at the mountain cabin every summer, over 100 years after Jakob first built it. They come from all over the country now, doctors and teachers and ranchers and business people, but they all carry something of Jakob and Clara in them. That stubborn determination, that capacity for deep love, that understanding that the most important things in life are not possessions or achievements, but the connections we forge with others. On the mantel above the fireplace, in a place of honor, sits a small carving that Jakob made for Clara on their first anniversary. It depicts a man on horseback, rope in hand, chasing a wild stallion across an open plain. On the base, Jakob had carved the words, "I roped a wild stallion at full gallop, but I courted her slow and steady and true." It is a reminder, passed down through 5 generations now, that some things are worth pursuing with all your strength and speed. But the most precious things, the things that truly matter, are worth taking your time to do right. Love, family, commitment, these cannot be rushed or forced. They must be courted slowly, built steadily, maintained truly. And so the story lives on, a testament to a mountain man and the woman he loved, to a wild stallion and the trust that was built between species, to a life lived fully in the shadow of the mountains and under the vast Montana sky. It is a story of the American West, of hardship and triumph, of isolation and community, but most of all, it is a love story. The kind that echoes through time and reminds us all of what we are capable of when we open our hearts to another person and commit ourselves fully to that connection. Jakob and Clara Thornton left behind more than just descendants. They left behind an example of how to love well, how to build a life together that honors both partners, how to face challenges with courage and grace. And they left behind the understanding that sometimes the wildest things, whether horses or hearts, need to be approached with patience and respect rather than force. The mountains stand eternal, and the wind still whispers through the pines around the old cabin. The trails that Jakob once walked are still there, traveled now by his great-great-great-grandchildren who carry his name and his legacy. And somewhere in the evening air, when the sun sets gold and red over the peaks, you can almost hear the thunder of hooves, almost see the silhouette of a rider with rope in hand, almost feel the presence of a love so strong it transcended even death itself. This was the story of Jakob Thornton and Clara Thornton, a mountain man and the woman who chose to love him, who built a life together in the wilderness, who raised a family and created a legacy that endures. It was a story that began with action and speed, with a wild chase across the grasslands and a desperate plea for help, but it became something slower and deeper and more true. It became a love for the ages, the kind that people still talk about generations later, the kind that reminds us all what really matters. And it all started with a simple truth. You can rope a wild stallion at full gallop, but you court the woman you love slow and steady and true. That was Jakob's wisdom, earned through experience and maintained through a lifetime of devotion. And it was a wisdom worth passing down through all the years that followed, a light to guide future generations as they navigated their own loves and challenges and triumphs. The Thornton family thrives to this day, a testament to the power of love to create and sustain. And at the heart of it all, remembered and honored always, are Jakob and Clara, together forever in the mountains they loved, in the family they built, in the story that will never fade. Their love was wild and gentle, fierce and patient, as untamed as a stallion running free and as steady as the mountains themselves. And it was true, always true, from that first moment to the very last and beyond into eternity.